Turn it up. Look, 100 years after 100 years, they lied to us about this and that. Told us all we from Africa. I made fiction characters turn into facts. Heard you tell me then it was not. No goddamn well that trick was capped. My wife and I wrote a book about it. It's a book with knowledge, evidence, and fact. And my other book got them haters shook, cause it's helping mind people take a closer look at their backgrounds in the background, showing my people where they supposed to look. Showing my people where they get it from, where they hit it from, all sorts of angles. When it comes to this research, you must please first, don't trust strangers. Find out all on your own is what I highly recommend and suggest. And if you looking for answers and content about me, I highly recommend you the best, which is my website at the link you see just across the screen. Don't let it miss you. I make it simple. I double down on that black and white. It's too official.
Oseo, my brothers and sisters, relatives, spiritual warriors, and free thinkers. Today, I want to begin this segment with you imagining yourself traveling to a different location that you may want to go. But this particular location will be very distant from your current home, meaning that it will be located in a totally different country where the people of that country would speak their native language, which of course will be different from yours. The people of this particular country would look different, think different, and even eat different foods from what you would normally intake back home. Their customs and traditions are also different, along with their dates and times. And even the weather of this place is under different atmospheric conditions from what you would normally experience back home. Imagine that you have never traveled to this place previously, nor even seen or heard of this place before, but you travel to this distant location still in hopes of providing a better present for yourself and maybe a better future for your family. And let me add that in order for you to live there, you will have to learn from scratch a totally new culture and a new way of life, and most importantly, possibly a new trade. In fact, the only way for you to survive in this new location is to learn how to communicate efficiently and effectively enough to conduct trade, so that you can now have a job or run a business and begin to somehow make an income in this foreign land. Sounds difficult, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. Even right now, with the availability of the internet and possibly having assistance from foreign interpreters at your expense, realistically, this would in fact be a difficult task for anyone to succeed in without the proper connections. Now, with you cognizant of how difficult it will be for you to do this sort of thing today, think about how complex this sort of thing would be if a person attempted this same exact thing at least 100 or more years ago without having the luxury of advanced technology, which should make you ask some questions. Like, was there ever one universal language? And if so, what was it? What was used for our ancestors to communicate with incoming foreigners that were arriving upon these lands? And how did the English language become the primary language spoken, opposed to the many indigenous languages that already existed here in America? Well, before I reveal the answers to those questions, let's take a look at the so-called history of language and how it became what it is today. Now, there are some people who would equate language and its creation to the Phoenicians, due to the many stories of these same said people being the actual creators of the alphabet. According to the Encyclopedia of Trade from Ancient Times to Present, most of the world's writing systems before the invention of the alphabet were pictograms, such as the Egyptian hieroglyphics. An alphabet is an important cultural innovation that allows easy and therefore potential mass literacy, more accurate record and contract keeping, adaptability to new intellectual concepts, and thus accelerated cultural change. The Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and Cyrillic alphabets all derived ultimately from the Phoenician, end quote. But what is very important to note here is that it also states that the Phoenicians are the ancestors to which all Western alphabets can be traced, but it is not the ancestor of all languages. And that is because an alphabet does not produce the language. It only provides a symbol for the oral sound that a person makes when speaking a particular language. The word language is derived from the Latin word lingua, which means the tongue and speech. It is defined in the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary as, quote, human speech, the expression of ideas by words or significant articulate sounds for the communication of thoughts, end quote. So, who are the Phoenicians? And why were they so important to the history of language? The Phoenicians knew that language was a very important part of trade. And before they allegedly created the alphabet, people wrote in cuneiform or pictograms, which could transcribe an entire idea versus just one word. This means that someone would have to be very educated, or rather indoctrinated, in order to produce these types of writings. And because they were known for traveling and expanding their trading empire all across Europe and Northern Africa, they knew how important it was to have a simpler means of communication, especially due to their mainland being a port city along the Mediterranean Sea, allegedly located in what is called Lebanon today. And so the Phoenician city of Byblos became an epicenter for trade. According to the Ancient History Encyclopedia, Byblos was the religious capital of Phoenicia, and papyrus was one of its principal articles of trade. For this reason, quote, the Greeks took the name of the city as their word for book, Byblos, and from their word for books named our word for Bible, ta Biblia, which means the books. Byblos was an important shipping port known for its timbers. The cedars of Lebanon was said to be prized by other countries because it was the first city to allegedly perfect shipbuilding. The Phoenicians carried a trade route and created colonies in what is now known as Spain, France, Italy, and Northern Africa. And while traveling to different locations meant learning different languages and written scripts, which in fact took time to study and understand, the Phoenicians allegedly decided to come up with the 22 symbols that we recognize today as an alphabet. It was understood that every word that can be spoken is comprised of different sounds placed together. The Phoenicians realized that 22 sounds make up the majority of words, so they created easy to write and easy to recall symbols that anyone can learn to match with these sounds. It was also said that every one of these sounds were consonants, but many of these sounds were in fact vowel sounds disguised as a consonant symbol or letter. And many of these letters have since expanded into what is now known as the English alphabet. This is why you will find a few letters of the English alphabet having the same exact sounds and symbols, and in some cases having the same sound with different symbols. For some mysterious reason, the English alphabet has a few repeating sounds, in which a new symbol was created for each one, bringing the total amount of letters used in the English alphabet to 26. And the French and Spanish alphabet includes one additional letter, bringing their totals to 27. Now, why is this important, you ask? Well, just as the Phoenicians were traders that traveled and created colonies, so were the English, Spanish, and the French. So in other words, all of these languages are in fact trade languages, in which each of these trade languages were eventually passed down from generation to generation over time. But in a more historical sense, these trade languages were better known as pidgin languages. A pidgin language is described today as a language with no native speakers, which is used for business, trade, or commerce. It is the reduced form of a language. But if there were no native speakers, then what language is it reduced from? A lingua franca. A lingua franca, from Italian meaning Frankish tongue, is a language systematically used as a common language to bridge the communication of those people that speak different native languages. English is a dramatic bridge language or a trade language with an added mixture of Spanish words, French words, Greek, Arabic, Latin, and it also heavily incorporates words from the many American Indian indigenous languages that were once spoken upon these lands, now known as the Americas. A lingua franca takes many words and their meanings or ideas and reduces them into a simplified version that could be understood by many. Lingua franca literally means Frankish tongue, a language spoken in Germany that eventually evolved into the language now known as Dutch. What is also very important to note here is that pidgin languages and lingua francas claim to have no native speakers, but that is very far from the truth. The process, which is used to simplify a language, also seeks to reduce the origin of the word spoken. But if you simply follow the word trail based on the sound of a word, the origin of that word usually shows up with a different spelling attached or a very closely related meaning that is often stated with not to be confused with, etc. Or the origin of that word could be closely related in meaning and just misunderstood. For example, the indigenous word water sounds like water, but this word actually means canoe, which is a boat that sits in the water. So pointing at the canoe in the water and saying water could have been mistaken by a foreigner as the liquid that was surrounding the canoe, and yet it is now our English word for water. Many languages are in fact the same language, hidden behind different spelling and reversed grammar, misunderstood but closely related in meanings and spoken with different pronunciations and different dialects. So now, this should make you ask some questions, like, how did we as a people begin to take on the English language as our primary language? And how did the English language become the official but yet non-official language of North America instead of the many indigenous tongues that were spoken before the colonization of this land? It was implemented through a process called polysynthesis. Polysynthesis is comprised of two terms, poly and synthesis. Poly meaning many or much, and synthesis meaning deductive reasoning, to put together or to combine. The linguistic definition of this word was coined by a French-American linguist by the name of Peter Stephen Duponceau in the year of 1816, and according to the 9th volume of the North American Review and Miscellaneous Journal that was published in the year 1819, Duponceau defines polysynthesis as, quote, the act of taking the greatest number of ideas and comprising them into the least number of words. Peter Duponceau immigrated to North America during the year of 1777 and became well known for his linguistics analysis of the indigenous languages of America spoken by the Indians. Peter Duponceau even wrote a book on the grammatical systems of the Indian languages. This book, prized by the Institutes of France, was called Mémoire sur le système grammatical de langue de quelqu'unes sous un jet de l'imagination, or rather translated in English as the memory of the grammatical system of the languages of some Indian nations of North America. which was published in the year of 1838. It was known since the earliest days of colonization that Indians had a very rich vocabulary. It was stated in the North American Review that, quote, Indians have an innumerable quantity of words. To the testimony of Mr. Duponcho and of Colden, we can add that of Roger Williams, who says in the most emphatic terms that the language of the Indians is exceedingly copious, and they have 5 or 6 words sometimes for one thing. This was obviously a major issue in terms of trade, and so prominent anthropologists like Franz Boas, Melville Herskovits, and even Margaret Mead eagerly studied some of the indigenous languages of America in hopes of using the process of polysynthesis in order to royally change these indigenous languages indefinitely. Listen closely. Polysynthesis not only simplifies a language, but it also carries a hidden agenda to systematically alter and even remove a language completely. It was done so in a matter of familiarity. Even nowadays, we as a people do not create new words to convey a slang word or a new word. It's just usually a commonly known word that is used, that somehow finds its way into having an alternate meaning or definition. According to the American Anthropologist, Volume 6, that was published in October of 1893, when talking about polysynthesis in English languages, the writer stated, quote, I know by experience how difficult it is for a missionary to convey to the minds of his hearers certain religious ideas. Again and again did I try, when missionary to the Ponca Indians, to find the proper Indian word for kingdom in order to make an even approximate translation of the petition, Thy kingdom come. Anyone who has lived amongst Indians know the worthlessness of adducing modern names, i.e., names of objects introduced among the Indians since the arrival of the white race on this continent, for the purpose of illustrating the construct of an Indian language, end quote. It was also well known by these anthropologists that I mentioned earlier, and even the ones that were in between, that by reducing the amount of words to one's vocabulary will cause a chain reaction that would in turn reduce the amount of ideas one may be able to produce, creating a generalized dumbing down effect on the population, and especially on the students that received this type of education. For example, an American anthropologist and one of the direct students of the famous German descent American anthropologist named Melville Herskovits, a name that you may recall me mentioning on numerous occasions, along with presenting his story to everyone in my previous documentaries, by the name of Margaret Mead, speaks about this during an interview on Social Anthropology, American Character, and Primitive Studies that was conducted and produced by Howard Langer in 1959. During this interview with Margaret Mead, she stated that the usage and learning a different language other than the trade language of English is suppressed, and that this is taught to our children at a young age by the systematic usage of polysynthesis. She also shared a very essential example on how it is all done.
We train people not to be able to learn foreign languages in the most fantastic way, because what we teach a child is, you see, if you take this pencil here, we teach a child this is a pencil. Now this isn't a pencil. This is an object made of wood and lead, designed for writing, which we call a pencil, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things.
So, this type of so-called educational training, which has been implemented within our public compulsory educational institutions' curriculums for several years now, successfully ensured that the English language became the primary language of nearly all households throughout America. And as the indigenous languages of the American Indians has since been royally reduced, it must be understood that this form of systematic indoctrination of our children has been unfortunately mutually consented by the descendants of the indigenous people of America, us. The entire purpose of sending our children to school is so that they could participate in the act of industry and trade by getting a good job. Although there are no existing legislators that list English as the official language of the United States, the transition from the indigenous languages that were once spoken to the English language was a systematic effort brought about to ensure business efficiency and that the trade ran more smoothly. On March 3, 1819, Congress passed an act making provision for the civilization of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements. It is very important to note that the word frontier is, quote, the border or confine of a country that is furthest advanced with a part that fronts an enemy or which an invading enemy meets at front, end quote. This act of 1819 states, quote, that for the purpose of providing against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements of the United States, and for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization, the President of the United States shall be, and he is hereby authorized in every case where he shall judge improvement in the inhabitants and condition of such Indians practicable, and that the means of instruction can be introduced with their own consent, to employ capable persons of good moral character, to instruct them in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching their children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and performing such other duties as may be enjoined, according to such instructions and rules as the President may give and prescribe for the regulation of their conduct in the discharge of their duties. End quote. Those indigenous families that accepted education and employment did so under the guise of civilization. So, where did this idea come from? Well, it could have came in response to the pleas of President Jefferson to the American Indian chiefs upon this land. According to the address made to Indian chiefs by Thomas Jefferson during the early 1800s, pleas were made for the tribes to go into business of trade and industry with the incoming foreigners, stating that those who accepted employment as, quote, cultivators of the earth for the maintenance of their families, those people would be supporting their families better and with less labor. They were assured that by raising stock and bread and by spinning and weaving clothes than by hunting, that more provisions will be provided, and that a woman will clothe more by spinning and weaving than a man by hunting, end quote. Thomas Jefferson also stated that, quote, compared with you, we are but as of yesterday in this land, yet see how much more we have multiplied by industry and the exercise of that reason which you possess in common with us. Follow then our example, brethren, and we will aid you with great pleasure, end quote. So, by sending our children to school and preparing them for the workforce and capitalism and industry, it was thought that we would somehow be excelling to a greater level in life, but this was actually the beginning of slavery here in America for those who were not yet prisoners of war. And we cannot get to this point without adopting a common language that was familiar and foreign at the same time, or so we thought, because there was in fact a universal language of trade already in use. Before interpreters and before foreigners could fully understand the indigenous language upon this land, and before the mixture of German and Indian languages that created English, What was used amongst our ancestors to communicate with incoming foreigners that were arriving upon these lands. The universal language available that was used to conduct trade in America amongst the Indians and foreigners during that time is the same language that is used with babies and young children before they could speak the language of adults. It's the same language used in sports amongst referees and umpires. It is the same language used between a baseball pitcher and a baseball catcher. It's the same language used in secret organizations and amongst law enforcement officials. It is the very same language that you would use if you were somewhere that you could not speak, the language that was commonly understood. This language is known universally as sign language. And according to the handbook of the church's missions to the Indians, entered at the post office of Hartford, Connecticut in 1854, but published in March of 1913, quote, "Sign language was of extensive development and existed all over the world and bore a resemblance to the sign language now used in some of our deaf-mute schools. Picture writing the world over probably grew out of sign language, the first stage in development. The second was pictographs, and the third, alphabet. These merge into each other by a slow and gradual process." End quote. It is unfortunate that the sign language is the common language of mainly the deaf and the mute today, and that is no longer widely understood as it was before, when it was used widely amongst those who conducted trade upon these lands. It too is one of the Indian languages that is now in danger of becoming extinct. And some may say for a very good reason, because it has been said that written language and spoken language was developed to hide one's true intent. And when we are focused so much on what is being said or what was written, we just might miss the signs.
I'm just here to make you think.